I wanted to start this presentation with a song that is a contemporary song, but it's a non-Western song, a non-avant-garde song. It's a song in Quechua, that is one of the living language from Latin America. And also I wanted to introduce it with it because it is what I was going to present. It's something related to the problem of translation. So I will start with the translation of this song. Okay, that I have translated to Spanish and from Spanish to English. So it's like third, and maybe now for Polish it will be more complicated. So I will translate. Potosi Hill, where are you? He has been stole by Spain. Return the silver and the gold. Beautiful hill, wake me up. Within that place, many end. Many have died for you. You have seen what has been lost. Beautiful hill, wake me up. Potosi Hill, where are you? He has been stole by Spain. Return the silver and the gold. I prepared this presentation in 5 chapters. It is a very generalistic and maybe basic presentation, but I had the idea that maybe in this context was kind of complicated to introduce what is modern or the modern in Latin America, so I'm doing a kind of general history. 1. All relation to modernity is a relation to coloniality. In the book of 1981, We Have Never Been Modern, Bruno Latour explained the false and constructed distinction by science between nature and society, between human and thing. And I quote him, "We should not mix the earth and the sky, the global and the local, the human and the non-human." In fact, modernity was the system that decided that our ancestors, indigenous, black, Roma, were not human and belong under the line of the being that legitimized colonialism and slavery. Those distinctions that also separate what is art from folklore, handcraft, religious practices, ethnic dances, etc., is the base of the system of categorization and separation of art and life, science and life, knowledge and life that finally establish the white supremacy as the path to follow. Afro-American artist Fred Wilson have said in relation to this and the museum, and I quote him, "The aesthetic anesthetize the historic and keep the imperial view within the museum." End of the quote. Modernity aspired to the creation of a unique and universal language. For this, it was based on industrialization and technology, on the principles of supposed human rights and democracy, on secularization and enlightenment, as well as on the intentions that they underline the idea of progress and continuous development. Modernity is a colonial structure created by Europe after the so-called conquest of America in 1492. Modernity is a universal, Eurocentric, male, white, heterosexual position and a blind point of view that assumes itself as a monocultural model and the only valid one to understand the political, social, and artistic behaviors. Europe has created modernity to validate their primary position in the construction of the global world with Europe at the center. Modernity has been the way of construction of the otherness, of exclusion and exotization of the otherness, of killing and slavery of the otherness. In this sense, the modern, and with it, the modern art, is a continuity of its evolutionary appeal of the modernity coloniality project, as Immanuel Wallenstein and Aníbal Quijano call it, that operate in the social institution, in everyday life, in our sexual relationships, in the art system. The birth of the museum, as Tony Bennett has pointed out, is then a very ideologized device of this project that constructs social discipline as public behavior and a hierarchy of the life experience and production. In the museum, you contemplate and assume that through narrative proposed in a comfortable safety proposed by all the control system of the institution. In the museum, you cannot dance, you cannot fuck, you cannot even make the revolution. Two, Spanish colonialism, schools, and the academia. During the Spanish colonialism in Abya Yala, name given to Latin America before the conquest by the Cuna indigenous, from 16th to 19th century, Baroque, as an ambivalent and multi-layered aesthetic, functioned as a way to legitimize the ideas of European beliefs and knowledge validated by Enlightenment. But at the same time, Baroque in Latin America provoke revolts to their own idea of what modernity is. During the first modernity before Industrial Revolution in Britain, that was also based on the extraction of southern materials as the whale and sea wolf oil from the Pacific Ocean, the extraction of raw material or the primitive accumulation, as Marx called it, established the basic hierarchies of modernity and capitalism in geopolitical and biopolitical terms. Colonial painting was a way of colonization and evangelization, but at the same time of subversion of the indigenous cosmologies that tries to survive, camouflating some local nature and Afro-indigenous idolatries, as this representation of Virgin Mary inserted in the Potosi Hill of Bolivia, the same of the song I have translated. Here, the Virgin Mary, it is camouflated with the Mother Earth or Pachamama. The Mother Earth survived despite the expensive extraction of the silver, that you can also see the indigenous in the mine taking the silvers. It is an anonymous painting, as much of the colonial painting at the time. The anonymous condition of much of this artistic production reflect the fact that the indigenous artists that were asked to paint them were not really considered subjects, but workforce as those who died inside the mine. If colonial painting was based on the idea of schools, as the Cusco one in Peru, the academia in the Viceroyalty of Mexico was founded during that time as a way to build a copy system structure of what was going on in artistic terms in the metropolis. The Royal Academy of San Carlos, the first one in the continent, was founded imitating the San Fernando Academia in Madrid in 1783. That institution, in opposition of the anonymous condition of colonial painters, introduced the authorship and the idea of the artist as a genius. It also validated the autonomy of the art from its religious or social function. Art was not anymore useful. Rejecting Jonathan Brown's idea, Jonathan Brown is an academic of NYU, of the Institute of Fine Arts, rejecting Jonathan Brown's idea that in this period the artistic production in Spain and its colonies was merely, and I quote, the ample sphere of the early modern world, I would like to insist that it was a dependent process and an equal relationship of metropolis, colony, center, periphery, influence, reception. Making a digression in this Spanish chapter, I also would like to point out that at the end of 19th century, in 1894, Spain founded the very unknown first Museum of Modern Art in the world, inside the National Library in Madrid. Third, French colonialism, the Museum of Fine Arts. In 19th century, during Latin America's first period of the republics, many countries suffered the input of the French Empire by, firstly, the education of Latin American elite in the principles of the French Republic, liberté, igualité, fraternité, and secondly, by the conquest of Mexico by Maximiliano I. Then, at that time, it was established the idea of Latin America as a continent and not anymore the Western Indies, as the Spanish colony used to call it. The fine arts were a basic way of neocolonization that continued the idea of the academia discipline and the autonomy of the artwork, promoting the copy of what was going on in France. The fine art museums started to be established by local elites in places as Mexico City, Santiago de Chile, Buenos Aires, or Caracas at the beginning of 20th century, most of them commemorating the first centenary of their independences from Spain and assuming the necessity of get closer to the French culture, as this image of Chilean Museum that imitates Paris' Petit Palais. A French culture that at that time was very much influenced not only by the democratic idea of the equality, but by the ideas of the Count of Gobineau, who published in 1853 the book about the inequality of human races, and validate, this is the book, sur l'inégalité des races humaines, and validate the exhibition of hundreds of human souls of Black, Asian, and indigenous people, like this image that represent a European priest with two different populations of the very south of America, Mapuches and Quehuascar, commemorating in Italy the fourth centenary of the conquest of America in 1892. Inuit, for example, that were talking in the first talk this morning, were also part of this human source. In this sense, in Latin America, we not only received the bourgeois, illuministic, and democratic ideas of France, but also the biological racism and neo-imperialism that was promoted in our context in order to validate, for example, the invasion at that time in Mapuche territories from the Chilean and Argentinian government, and perpetuate the separation between the cultural and secular local bourgeois and the savage and religious popular mixed race and indigenous population. 4. US colonialism, the modern museum, and the contemporary museum. During Second World War, the Museum of Modern Art in New York created the idea of Latin American art. In 1943, you know, like France created the idea of Latin America and the US created the idea of Latin American art. The museum that have been exhibited Latin American artists almost from its origin, with Diego Rivera in 1931, for example, constructed rapidly a collection proposed by Nestor Rockefeller and Alfred Barr Jr., and the curatorship of Lincoln Christen, who also informed Rockefeller about the political position of the countries he visited: Argentina, Brazil, Chile, Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, Uruguay, and Mexico. Beside the political infiltration, he established what was the modern art of Central and South America through an exhibition and a publication, that is this one, that for the very first time established a narrative of the art of the subcontinent from colonial times. The American, then, should be expressed to name the US people, the US industry, the US art. Their neighbors, on the other hand, should always have another category: Hispanic, Latin, Iberian, etc. The United States has constructed an imaginary about their southern neighbors, and they keep for themselves the American. At that time, the United States, not only stole the idea of modern art to Paris, as the famous book of Serge Guilbeault said, but stole the idea of the American, creating the distinction between American and Latin American art. And finally, created the distinction between modern and the contemporary museum. In 1948, the Boston Museum of Modern Art, founded in 1936, changed its name to Institute of Contemporary Art as an affront to New York's MoMA, expressed in the call Boston Manifesto, that is this document. The Institute changed its name, denouncing that modern art has created a frontier between the public and the art. Modern art was, and I quote, "Modern art was come to signify for millions something unintelligible, even meaningless," they said. Modern art was already a style in art history, and was an oppressive discourse coming from the leftist and communist Europe. The contemporary, on the contrary, was the strictly speaking US American. After the war, most of the countries in industrialization processes in Latin America were concerned about the idea of creating a modern art museum. As summarized the temperament of the architecture school of Valparaiso in the 50s, what was involved was to ask how to be American and modern at the same time. That is, for them, how to think modernity in an American way that, driving creative freedom, reverse the field of architecture and body experience imposed by Eurocentric functionalism and rationalism. The first 3 museums of modern and contemporary art were constructed in Latin America at that time. The Museum of Contemporary Art of Santiago de Chile in 1946, followed by the Museum of Modern Art in Sao Paulo in 1947 and Rio de Janeiro in 1948, constructed by Oscar Niemeyer and Alphonse Edouard Reidy, with rationalistic orientation, each of them. Chilean Contemporary Art Museum was founded the same year that France opened the Maison d'Amérique Latine, as an effort to keep the eye on the already lost territories of its cultural colonialism. Artist Marcos Bonta opened the Museum of Contemporary Art, the one you can see in this image, inside the university as part of a national development project that was taking form by the Radical Party through the President Gabriel González Videla. It was firstly located at the Parthenon of Quinta Normal, that is the image you see, a copy of the Greek one, so-called origin of European culture, and then moved to the old academia in the back of the Fine Art Museum. That is the image you have already seen here. This is then the Contemporary Museum moved to the back, and it is still there. Chilean Avant-Garde developed in the first university's Faculty of Fine Arts in the continent, founded in 1930 by the Groupe Montparnasse, that bring the French avant-garde there. And this is the image of the first exhibition installation that also have been just rebuilt inside the museum in this process of recreating installations. On the other hand, in 1947 and 1948, were opened the museum, the Modern Art Museum of Brazil, coinciding with the process of industrialization, taking New York's Museum of Modern Art as a model to follow. Brazil was passing by a period after the war of intense participation of the private sector in the process of creating a network of cultural equipment that promote modernist aesthetic. We have to consider also the construction of its capital, Brasilia, in the 50s as an entire process of renovation from the ground. Both museums act as cultural centers for the present with an intense didactic activities, reflecting 18th century British ideas about the museum as a place for the education of the proletarians. The Museum of Modern Art of Sao Paulo, it is located at the Ibirapuera Park, just at the size of the Biennale building, in the architecture complex designed by Oscar Niemeyer in 1954 and reformed by Italian architect Lina Bobardi in 1982, including in Lina Bobardi's reformation a radical museography that interfered the linear modern processes with indigenous and popular culture. The museum opened with the exhibition From Figurativism to Abstractionism, with a clear copy system of avant-garde from Europe, curated by its first director, the Belgian critic Léon Degan, with works of Jan Arp, Alexander Calder, Delannoy, Kandinsky, Picabia, with a few Brazilians as Valdemar Cordeiro. The Museum of Sao Paulo was also responsible for the creation of the International Biennale of Sao Paulo in 1951, being the same institution until 1963. All these elements conflued in the idea of promoting internationally a modern concept of the nation. Poet Mario de Andrade, brother of Osvaldo de Andrade, author of the main manifesto of Brazilian avant-garde, the Anthropophagus one of 1920, was an opponent of the project of the Museum of Modern Art in Sao Paulo, saying that it was more necessary a didactic museum with reproductions and copies of consecrated artworks that would be more useful for the purpose of culturally instructing of the citizens. Paradoxically, this idea was materialized at that time by New York Museum of Modern Art, that created in Lima, Peru, with the support of UNESCO, the Museum of Pictorial Reproductions in 1851, with 27 high-resolution photographic reproduction of masterpiece of the MoMA, maintained until 1997. Photography as a means of promoting, paradoxically, objects with aura. The acerbic of this museum, saved at the University of San Marco in Lima, will later be the material for the work of the Peruvian artist Fernando Brai's vision of Western painting of 2002, that is the image you have here, saving the photos of this reproduction museum and repainting some other famous work of Eurocentric art history. Rio's Modern Art Museum was also the scene of several events of the artistic avant-garde of the 60s, from the New Realism to the neo-concretes, including the Tropicalism. This is the building of Rio de Janeiro's museum. Elio Itizica's Parangolés, that included the articulation of geometric abstraction, neo-concretism, and people of color, as a proposing of articulating avant-garde ideas and popular Brazilian culture, was firstly proposed there. That these are the images of Elio Itizica. I don't know if it's pretty known here, with Mangueira, that it was his partner in this project of included like the people from the hills inside this modern institution. Considering all these elements and the modern versus contemporary debate in the United States, there is an enormous and paradoxical distance between Brazilian project of modernization in a modern art museum that promote the very contemporary, and Chilean neoclassic conservative architecture that propose a French and modern aesthetic. It was like the contemporary was much more modern, and the modern was much more like a Kunsthalle or something like that. In that moment of post-war and institutionalization of Latin American art in the United States, the neocolonialism reflected on the public concern of the Latin American countries to establish museums of modern or contemporary art for modernizing the artistic, curatorial, and museum practices. It dealt with an ideology that was based on a supposed need for access to the mainstream, which, as in Edward Said's words, will respond to and I quote, a tremendously energetic attempt to join the metropolitan world. Although, as the Argentinian critic Damián Bayón points out, the timidity of the modern practice promoted by the Latin American states was evident in its articulation with a modern French model already validated as a base. Latin American avant-garde was not autonomous in its European dependency, and with its flow independent as Elio Itizica's work, it needed to be part of the local social problem. At the end, what I would like to pose is the idea that Latin American avant-garde, it's never autonomous because it's never stopped taking European ideas, but at the same time, when they move away from that point of view, they have to be based on a local structure. And finally, I think it's 5. 5, the absence of the modern and contemporary museum. In the more indigenous countries, as Peru and Bolivia, never exists a museum of modern or contemporary art. We can say that the general concern to enter inside the system of modern museums in Latin America, it is a bourgeois and white concern that in certain Andean space did not exist. In the capitals of Peru and Bolivia, its absence have been significant. In 1974, Damien Bayon, the critic I have already quoted, commented, "In the last 2 cities, the need for a museum devoted exclusively to modern art, it feels imperiously. Let's hope it does not take long to arrive." That was in 74. Peru opened its first Museum of Contemporary Art in 2013, and Bolivia still don't have a Museum of Modern or Contemporary Art, even though La Paz has a contemporary art biennial. That means that they are the liar, or that modern art museum is a colonial and Western-centric structure promoted by Europe and the US? In the 70s and 80s, many artists in Peru asked about this problem of the need or not of a modern and contemporary art museum. In 1979, for example, Francisco Mariotti signaled the dumps of Lima as the only possible modern art museum. While Mariela Ceballos from the collective EPS Huayco parodied with a comic of a public bus where a woman asked to go out at the non-existent modern art museum. It's a, they are going out at the modern art museum. More recently, at the beginning of 21st century, many artists and curators created their own museums as a way to construct an own history of art and culture, mass media and press, from specific and non-evolutionary topics. Susana Torres proposed the Neo-Inca Museum as a way to understand Peruvian pre-colonial culture, expanded to the contemporary popular culture as the local modernity. Meanwhile, Giuseppe Campuzano established the Transvesti Museum, in which promote a non-progressive and non-original reading of the non-binary sexuality and the travestism from the pre-colonial period to the present. We can say that indigenous is also contemporary if we want. We were never modern because modernity was a colonial and neo-colonial imposition from the north. European modernity have been based in back-and-forth system of first, extraction in our territories with our workforce, secondly, reinventing that in scientific, artistic, and symbolic products, and finally, imposing it back there as the path to follow. Our non-modernity, even though it is not that one proposed by Bruno Latour. It is then an indigenous, black, Roma, and non-white position that have always been in the limbo of trying to be modern and not be able to be. That's why some authors said that we have always been postmodern, not being able to catch the transformation system of the modern or even transmodern, as Enrique Dussel proposed, as a territory that have led beyond those debates. Nevertheless, what we can think is that even there have been efforts to create our modern art system, that one, when works, have been against the imposed necessity to copy the Eurocentric model of what is or should be the modern culture and museum for us. At the end, we have been historically the bodies and territories to be exploited, and our modernity is a bastard one that can be understood only as the European dump. Thank you.